Get in here before you freeze to death. That was all she said. No hesitation, no screaming, no calling the police. Just a 72-year-old widow alone, broke and half-frozen herself, swinging open her front door to 5 massive Hells Angels bikers bleeding on her porch in the worst blizzard Ohio had seen in 30 years. Nobody on that street opened their door that night. Nobody but Maggie. And what happened next, what walked back through that same door weeks later, would leave an entire town speechless. If this story moves you, please subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The kerosene heater clicked 3 times before it caught. Margaret Lawson counted those clicks every single evening, the way other women counted their blessings, carefully, quietly, and with the full understanding that one day the number might come up short. She pressed her palms flat against the side of the old metal cylinder and held them there, feeling the warmth seep into her fingers, the way bread dough rises slow, uncertain, but eventually real. "Come on," she whispered. "Don't quit on me tonight." It didn't quit. Not that night. She pulled her cardigan tighter and crossed the small front room to the window. Outside, the sky had turned the color of old pewter, and the wind was already talking. Not howling yet, just talking, low and serious, the way a man sounds right before he delivers bad news. Maggie had lived in Ridgemont, Ohio for 51 years. She had watched the steel mill close. She had watched her husband Raymond get laid off at 53 and never quite recover, not in his spirit, not in his health. She had watched her daughter move to Columbus, then to Charlotte, then to somewhere in Arizona she could never quite picture. She had watched neighbors pack U-Hauls in the middle of the night like they were escaping something shameful, and she had stood on her porch and waved at every single one of them, even when her heart was breaking clean in half. Ridgemont didn't die all at once. That was the cruelest part. It died slowly, the way a fire dies. First the big flames, then the small ones, then just the embers glowing red and stubborn in the dark, refusing to give up even when giving up would be the merciful thing. Maggie was one of those embers. She turned away from the window and walked back to the kitchen. The overhead light flickered once, twice, and she instinctively reached for the drawer where she kept the candles. Raymond had always teased her about that. "Maggie, you've got enough candles in that drawer to light a cathedral." She could still hear the way he laughed when he said it, low and warm, rolling out of his chest like thunder from a long way off. Raymond had been gone 11 years now. She still talked to him sometimes, not in a sad way, in the way that some habits are so deeply worn into a person that stopping them would feel like tearing out a wall. She pulled 2 candles from the drawer, set them in the old brass holders on the kitchen table, and struck a match. The flame caught immediately. "There," she said to no one, or maybe to Raymond, or maybe just to the room itself, just to prove that warmth was still possible in a place that seemed determined to forget it. She opened the refrigerator. Half a carton of eggs, a block of butter going soft at the corners, 3 potatoes, one of them starting to go, a pot of bean soup she'd made 2 days ago, enough for maybe 2 more servings if she stretched it carefully, 2 biscuits wrapped in a dish towel. Maggie stood there looking at it all for a moment, doing the quiet arithmetic that poor people learn without ever being taught. She had $12 and some change until her Social Security check cleared on Tuesday. The soup would last another day. The biscuits, she'd save those for morning. The eggs she could stretch through the week if she was careful. She closed the refrigerator door gently, as if closing it too hard might disturb what little was inside. "Valentine's Day," she said softly and almost smiled. She and Raymond had never made a big production of Valentine's Day. He'd bring her flowers, usually whatever was left at the gas station by the time he got there, and she'd make his favorite, which was pot roast with those little pearl onions in a store-bought pie. Nothing fancy, but they'd sit at this same table in these same chairs, and he'd reach across and take her hand, and he'd say, "The power went out. All at once, no flicker, no warning, just gone." The refrigerator stopped humming, the baseboard heaters went cold. The small television in the corner of the living room died mid-sentence, whatever the weatherman had been saying swallowed whole by the sudden silence. Maggie stood very still in the dark kitchen, lit only by the 2 candle flames, and she felt the temperature in the house begin to drop almost immediately. Not dramatically, not all at once, just the warmth started to leave, slowly, quietly, with purpose. "Okay," she said, "just that, okay." She was 72 years old. She had been through ice storms and power outages, in a husband's death, and a daughter's drift. In 11 years of learning how to be a whole person, when the person you built your whole life around wasn't there anymore. She was not going to fall apart because the lights went out. She pulled her heaviest coat from the hook by the door. Raymond's old work coat, the thick brown Carhartt one with the flannel lining that still impossibly smelled faintly like him when the weather was cold enough, and she put it on over her cardigan. She put on 2 pairs of wool socks. She found the extra blanket in the hall closet and carried it to the armchair closest to the kerosene heater. She sat down, she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. That was what Maggie Lawson did when things went wrong. She didn't panic. She didn't call for help. There was rarely anyone to call. And besides, she'd learned long ago that panic was just fear with nowhere useful to go. She settled in. She got quiet. She let herself feel whatever needed to be felt, and then she figured out the next small thing she could do, and she did it. The wind outside was no longer talking. It was shouting now. She could hear it pressing against the windows, finding the gaps in the old wooden frame, slipping cold fingers through the cracks she'd plugged with rolled-up towels. The house groaned once, a long, low sound from somewhere deep in the walls, and Maggie pressed her lips together and said quietly but firmly, "You hold. You hear me? You hold." She didn't know if she was talking to the house or to herself, maybe both. Outside snow was beginning to fall in earnest, but Maggie couldn't see it. She was sitting with her eyes closed, conserving warmth, listening to the storm introduce itself to Ridgemont the way trouble always introduces itself, loud, uninvited, and absolutely certain of its welcome. 3 blocks away, Dorothy Fennick was peeking through her curtains, watching the storm, and she'd already locked every door and pulled every shade. Across the street, old Bill Harmon had a generator running in his garage and wasn't about to share it with anyone. He'd made that clear enough at the last block association meeting back when there was still a block association. The Krishnamurthy family, 2 houses down, had driven to stay with relatives in Youngstown 2 days ago when the forecast first came in. Smart people. Careful people. Maggie had nowhere to go, had never been the kind of person to run towards somewhere safer when somewhere else might need her. She remembered, and she couldn't say why she remembered it right then, sitting in the cold dark while the storm built outside. She remembered the winter of 1987, when the Paulson family across the street had lost their heat for 4 days in a January cold snap. Their youngest little Denny had been maybe 3 years old. Maggie had gone over every morning and every evening with food. Hot food, every time, without being asked. Jenny Paulson tried to pay her, once pressed a $20 bill into Maggie's hand at the door, and Maggie had pressed it right back. "You keep that," she'd said. "You've got enough to worry about." Jenny Paulson had cried right there in her own doorway. Maggie hadn't understood why at the time. She'd just done what seemed obvious. You see someone cold and hungry, you help. You see someone struggling, you don't look away. That was the whole math of it as far as Maggie was concerned. She'd never understood people who made it more complicated than that. The wind hit the house so hard then that one of the candle flames guttered sideways and almost died. Maggie leaned forward and cupped her hand around it, and it steadied. "There," she said again. "There." She had no way of knowing, couldn't have known sitting alone in her cold candlelit house on Valentine's night, that 5 men were fighting for their lives less than a mile away. She had no way of knowing that on Highway 44, in the absolute worst of the storm, 5 motorcycles had gone down on black ice in a matter of seconds. No warning. Just velocity, and then the sudden brutal end of it, machines that weighed 500–600 pounds laying themselves down on the asphalt and sliding sparks in the dark, and 5 men thrown from them like they weighed nothing at all. She couldn't know that the man they called Garrett had pulled himself to his feet first, inventory checking his own body, the way combat men do. Arms, legs, ribs, vision, and then gone immediately to the man closest to him, a younger rider named Marcus, who was sitting on the road holding his forearm to his chest at an angle that made Garrett's stomach clench. "Marcus," Garrett's voice had been flat and immediate. "Talk to me." "I'm good," Marcus had said, which was so obviously not true that 2 of the other 3 riders actually laughed, a short, helpless, adrenaline and relief kind of laugh, the kind that comes out when the alternative is something darker. "You're not good," Garrett had said, "but you're alive. That's enough for right now." He'd looked at his phone. No signal. He'd looked down the highway in both directions. Nothing, no lights. No movement. just the storm swallowing everything it touched. He'd looked at his riders. Danny and Cole were already on their feet and moving, checking each other over with the practiced efficiency of men who'd been in hard places before. Big Ray, real name Raymond, which Maggie would not learn until much later, a detail that would make her breath catch when she heard it, was sitting against his downed bike with a gishoik above his eye that was bleeding freely, but not, Garrett had decided, catastrophically. 4 injured to varying degrees, one with a probable broken arm. Temperature dropping by the minute, no way to call for help. Garrett had stood in the middle of Highway 44 in a whiteout blizzard on Valentine's night, and he'd made a decision the way he always made decisions, quickly, without the luxury of uncertainty, and with the full understanding that he was the one who would live with the consequences, regardless of how it turned out. "We walk," he'd said. "Garrett, we walk," he'd said again, and there was something in his voice that closed the conversation the way a key turns in a lock. "There's a town, can't be more than a mile, maybe mile and a half. We stay with the bikes, we die, simple as that, nobody leaves anybody. We move together. Marcus, you keep that arm against your chest, and you tell me the second you can't feel your feet." "Understood." Marcus had nodded. "Big Ray, you good to walk?" "Been uglier nights," Ray had said, pressing his sleeve against his forehead. "No, you haven't," Cole had said, and somehow impossibly they'd all almost smiled. They walked. Into the storm, into the dark, into the kind of cold that stops being a sensation and starts being a decision. A slow, patient, relentless argument being made against every cell in your body, that staying warm is too much work, that stopping is easier, that lying down in the quiet isn't dying. Not really, it's just resting. They walked. Garrett counted steps when his mind started to slip. Danny kept up a low, steady stream of talk, nothing important, just words, just sound, just the human noise of someone refusing to go quiet. Cole held Marcus's good arm and matched his pace. Big Ray stopped twice to adjust his grip on the makeshift compress he'd made from his bandana. And both times Garrett turned around and waited without saying anything. And both times Ray caught up and gave him a short nod, and they moved again. 1 foot, then the next, 1 foot, then the next. Ridgemont appeared in front of them, not like a town appears with lights and signs and the welcoming geometry of civilization, but like a suspicion. Dark shapes, outlines, buildings that might be buildings and might be just the storm playing tricks on eyes that were desperately searching for something real to hold on to. But then a street, pavement under their feet instead of asphalt, sidewalks, and then Maple Terrace. Garrett looked up and down the street. The houses were all dark. Of course they were, the whole town had lost power. But this wasn't just dark because of outage. This was locked door dark, pulled curtain dark. The particular dark that happens when people have decided that whatever is outside tonight is not their problem, and they've made peace with that decision and gone back to their generator-warmed rooms and their battery-powered radios and their survival. He understood it. He didn't hold it against anybody. He went to the first door and knocked anyway. Nothing. Second door, knocked, waited, knocked again. A voice muffled, "Go away, I've called the police." He went to the third house, knocked, nothing, not even the pretense of a voice. Marcus was shaking hard now. The deep, bone-rattling shudder of a body trying to generate heat it can't make fast enough. Danny had his arm around him and was talking steadily into his ear, but his own lips were going blue at the corners. Big Ray had stopped pressing the compress against his head because his hand was too stiff to maintain the pressure. Garrett turned to look at them, really looked. He had maybe 20 minutes, maybe less. He turned back to the street. And that was when he saw it. One window, one small, warm, wavering, impossible light. A candle, burning in the window of a small house at the end of the block. He stared at it for a moment, just a moment, the way a man stares at something he doesn't quite trust himself to believe in. Then he walked toward it. He climbed the porch steps. He raised his fist, and he knocked 3 times heavy and deliberate, the kind of knock that says, "I know you're there, and I need you to be brave for just a moment." Inside the house, he could hear absolutely nothing. He waited. He knocked again, and the door opened. She was smaller than he expected. That was the first thing. He didn't know what he'd expected. He hadn't had the mental bandwidth to expect anything by that point, but this woman, this tiny white-haired woman in an oversized brown work coat and wool socks, holding a candle in one hand and looking up at him with eyes that were, he would describe this later and struggle to find the right word, finally settling on steady. She looked at him with eyes that were absolutely, completely steady. He saw her take it all in. 5 men, leather, patches, blood, ice, the shaking, the hunched shoulders, and the blue lips, and the sheer desperate animal need of 5 human beings who had run out of options. He saw her process it. He saw the moment when whatever calculation she was running in her head reached its conclusion. And she said, her voice not shaking, not kind in a performative way, not careful the way people are careful when they're afraid. She said it like she was reading something from a page she'd memorized a very long time ago. Get in here before you freeze to death. Garrett Sullivan, who had negotiated contracts worth 9 figures, who had stood in boardrooms and courtrooms and, in the middle of Highway 44 in a blizzard, and made hard decisions without flinching. Garrett Sullivan felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. He stepped inside. 4 men followed him. The door closed against the storm, and Margaret Lawson, 72 years old, broke and alone and invisible to most of the world, turned to face 5 strangers in her living room and said briskly, like someone who had already decided and just needed to get on with it, "Who's hurt? Worst point to them. Right now, we'll start there." Garrett stepped inside and the door closed behind them, and for one long second, nobody moved. 5 massive men stood in Margaret Lawson's living room, dripping melted ice onto her wooden floor, breathing hard, filling every inch of a space that had been built for one quiet woman and her memories. The candlelight made their shadows enormous. Their leather vests, the patches, the wings, the insignia that made most people cross the street caught the flame and threw it back in warm fragments. They smelled like cold metal and exhaust, and the particular animal smell of men who had been afraid and then survived it. Maggie looked at all 5 of them and did not step back. Not 1 inch. "Who's hurt worst?" she said again, because nobody had answered her the first time, and she was not a woman who repeated herself for her own benefit. "Point right now." Garrett pointed to Marcus without hesitating. Marcus was the youngest of the 5, maybe 30, maybe a little less, and he was doing the thing people do when they're hurt and trying not to show it, which is to hold very still and breathe very carefully and smile in a way that doesn't reach anywhere near their eyes. "Arm," Garrett said. "He went down hard. Could be broken." Maggie was already crossing toward Marcus before Garrett finished the sentence. She came up to about the middle of his chest. These were big men, working men, men built wide through the shoulders and solid through everything else. And she looked up at him with that same steady expression and said, "What's your name?" "Marcus," he said. "Marcus, I'm going to touch your arm. I'm going to be as careful as I can, but I need you to tell me exactly where it hurts. Can you do that?" He blinked. Something shifted in his face, a kind of startled softness, like a dog that's been braced for a kick and receives a gentle hand instead. "Yes, ma'am." She reached up and placed her fingertips very carefully along the length of his forearm. He hissed through his teeth when she reached a spot just above the wrist, and she stopped immediately. "There," she said. "Yeah." "Okay." She stepped back, looked at Garrett and said, "It may be broken, or it may just be a bad sprain. Either way, we're not going to do anything useful about it tonight. I need him to keep it still and elevated. Can you make sure that happens?" "Yes," Garrett said. "Good." She turned to the rest of them. "The man with the cut on his head, come here." Big Ray, who had not been told to go anywhere by anyone in a very long time, went. She made him sit in Raymond's old armchair, and she'd pulled it close to the kerosene heater, and she went to the bathroom and came back with a first aid kit that had seen better days but still had what it needed inside it. She cleaned Ray's gash with hydrogen peroxide, and he sat there perfectly still and perfectly silent, which Cole would later say was the most shocking thing he witnessed that entire night, because Big Ray was not a man who was typically silent about anything. "You got stitches from this before?" Maggie asked him, pressing gauze to the cut with firm, steady pressure. "Once or twice," Ray said. "This is going to need them. I can't do stitches, but if you hold this tight and don't move it around, it should stop on its own. Head wounds bleed like they're trying to make a point. Doesn't always mean what it looks like." "Yes, ma'am," Ray said. And then, because he clearly couldn't help himself, "You sound like you've done this before." "Raymond, my husband, worked at the mill for 23 years, she said, not looking up from the wound. "I put that man back together more times than I can count. Hands, fingers, a broken collarbone once. You learn what you need to know." Something passed between the men. Not a look exactly, more of a shared stillness, a collective recalibration. This woman had a dead husband and a first aid kit and a house that was losing heat by the minute, and she was talking about him like he was still just out back somewhere. Like his coat on the hook by the door was going to be picked up and worn again any day now. The rest of you, Maggie said without pausing, get out of those wet things, not your shirts if you'd rather not, but coats, outer layers, anything soaking wet. Hang them on the hooks by the door, and then sit down before you fall down. You're all running on empty and you know it. Danny started to say something, some kind of joke. Garrett could see it forming on his face, but Cole put a hand on his arm and Danny closed his mouth. This was not the moment for jokes. Even Danny, who was constitutionally incapable of treating any situation with entire seriousness, understood that. They did what she said. Cole went to the hooks. Danny followed him. Garrett shrugged out of his jacket, last moving slowly, watching the room, the way he always watched rooms, not with suspicion, not anymore, but with the old habit of assessment. The habit that had kept him alive in places that were far less kind than this one. The house was cold, getting colder, but the kerosene heater in the corner was holding a small, stubborn circle of warmth, and Maggie had already angled it toward the center of the room without anyone asking her to. There were candles on the kitchen table. He could see them through the door, two flames burning with the kind of determination that small things sometimes have. I thought this woman has been alone in this cold and this dark, and she set those candles and she sat in that chair and she waited out the storm by herself and she was going to be fine. The recognition of it hit him somewhere unexpected. Do you have people coming? He asked her. Family, neighbors checking on you. She was wrapping Ray's head with a strip of clean bandage and she didn't look up. No. Is there someone we should call? No signal, she said simply. And no, there's no one. She tied off the bandage with neat, practiced fingers. There. She stepped back and looked at Ray with the satisfied expression of someone who has solved the most immediate problem and is already thinking about the next one. Then she turned to Garrett. Are you the one who knocked on my door? Yes. How many doors did you knock on before mine? A pause. 3. She nodded, and the nod contained something complicated, not quite bitterness, not quite resignation. More like a confirmation of something she already knew, but had hoped she was wrong about. Well, she said, you found the right one eventually. Come help me with the blankets. He followed her down the narrow hallway to the linen closet. She pulled the door open and started handing him things. Blankets, heavy wool ones, and old quilts, and a sleeping bag that had seen some years, and he took each one without being asked twice. The closet smelled like cedar and something floral, old fabric softener maybe. And the entire narrow space was organized with a precision that told him everything about the woman. Every shelf labeled in pen on strips of masking tape, every blanket folded with its edge facing out. You don't have to do this, he said. He didn't know why he said it. It was true, but it also felt inadequate, like handing someone a teaspoon when what they needed was a bucket. She took the last blanket from the shelf and looked at him. I know I don't have to, she said. That's not actually the point. She walked back to the living room and he followed her. She distributed blankets without ceremony, this one to Marcus, who'd been maneuvered into the kitchen chair with his arm elevated on a stack of Raymond's old paperbacks. This one to Ray in the armchair. These two for Danny and Cole on the floor closest to the heater. The sleeping bag for Garrett, who she handed it to and said, you're the biggest, you'll need it most. He wanted to argue. He didn't. I'm going to heat the soup, she said to the room. It's bean soup. There's enough for everybody if we're not greedy about it, and I don't think anybody here is going to be greedy tonight. Biscuits tomorrow, that's what I have. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Danny said quietly, completely, without his usual deflective humor, Ma'am, you don't have to give us your food. Maggie was already in the kitchen lighting the gas burner with a long match. The stove at least worked without electricity, which was the single advantage of being too broke to have ever upgraded to the electric model she'd wanted for 20 years. Of course I don't have to, she set her back to them. Lord, you boys need to learn a different way of thinking about kindness. It's not about have to, it's about what's right in front of you. She stirred the soup. The spoon scraped against the bottom of the pot in a steady, rhythmic way that was somehow the most calming sound any of them had heard in hours. Cole, who was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and the blanket pulled around his shoulder, said, and he said it so quietly that it almost got swallowed by the wind outside. My grandma used to make soup like that. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Garrett sat on the floor near the heater, his back against the old couch, the sleeping bag pulled around his legs, and he watched Maggie through the kitchen doorway. She moved the way people move when they know a space completely, when they've lived in a room long enough that every step is automatic and every reach lands exactly where it needs to. She knew where everything was without looking. She added something to the soup pepper, he thought, maybe something else. And she hummed something very softly just under her breath, not quite music and not quite not music. How long you been in this house, he asked. She didn't turn around. 51 years. You grow up in Ridgemont? No, grew up in Coshocton, came here when I married Raymond. A short pause. Stayed when everybody else left. Whitewash? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, because somebody had to. He let that sit, because it deserved to sit. Marcus shifted in the kitchen chair, and Maggie was there before anyone else moved, adjusting the stack of paperbacks under his arm, resettling the blanket around his shoulders with the brisk efficiency of someone who has given care without expecting it to be noticed. You warm enough? She asked him. Getting there, he said. And then, I'm sorry we busted in on you like this. She looked at him. You knocked. That's not busting in. Busting in would have been coming through the window. She almost smiled. I'm grateful you had the manners. He laughed, actually laughed short and surprised, and the sound of it in that cold candle-lit house was something close to miraculous. It broke something open, like the first crack in winter ice. Danny started laughing too. Then Cole. Even Big Ray, who looked like he hadn't laughed at anything in approximately a decade, let out a low rumble from the armchair that could generously be called a chuckle. Garrett didn't laugh. He watched her. She had gone back to the stove without waiting for the moment, without basking in it, without even seeming to register that she'd caused it. She just stirred the soup and let the warmth in the room do what warmth does when you give it enough time. He pulled the leather notebook book from the inside pocket of his jacket. He always carried it, had carried one since he was 24 years old, since a mentor of his had told him the most dangerous thing a man can do is let something important pass by without writing it down. He opened it to a blank page, and he wrote her name, just her name, Margaret Lawson, and underneath it, Maple Terrace, Ridgemont, Ohio. And underneath that, in his small, precise handwriting, the only light on the street. He put the notebook back in his pocket. She served the soup in mismatched bowls. She had exactly 4, so she served the 4 most obviously miserable ones and told Garrett she'd use the pot itself, which she clearly intended to do no performance about it, just straight, practical problem solving. He took the pot from her hands. Take a bowl, he said. I'll use the pot. She looked at him for a moment. Take a bowl, he said again, and something in the way he said it apparently landed correctly because she took the bowl. They ate in the half-dark, the 5 men and the 1 woman. The soup, hot and thick and tasting like exactly what it was. Humble, simple food made by careful hands from limited ingredients, which meant it tasted in that specific moment like the best thing any of them had eaten in years. Danny ate every drop, and then sat holding the empty bowl like he was considering licking it. Big Ray's bowl disappeared in what seemed like approximately 4 bites. Marcus ate slowly and carefully, managing the spoon with his good hand, and Maggie watched him just long enough to see he was managing, and then she looked away to give him the dignity of doing it himself. When the bowls were empty, she collected them without being asked and took them to the kitchen and washed them in cold water, because she had no hot, and nobody said anything about it because there was nothing to say. Garrett said, what we do to help, tonight I mean. You can stay warm and stay alive, she said from the kitchen. That's enough doing for one night. The roof, he said. I noticed when we came in the ceiling in the corner, there's water damage. A beat of silence. Then, it leaks when there's heavy snow. I've got buckets. How many buckets? Longer silence. Enough, she said, and the word had a particular texture to it, not quite defensive, but private. The word of someone who has learned to make enough means sufficient even when it doesn't. Garrett didn't push it, he stored it. Cole had fallen asleep against the wall. The blanket pulled to his chin, his face slack and young-looking in the candlelight, younger than he looked when he was awake and guarded. Danny was fighting sleep with the losing determination of a man who knows he's losing and keeps fighting anyway. Ray's chest was rising and falling slowly in the armchair, his head tipped back, the clean bandage white against his dark hair. Marcus looked at Garrett across the room and said quietly, "We made it." "We made it," Garrett agreed, "because of her." Garrett looked toward the kitchen doorway where Maggie was moving quietly through the dark, extinguishing the unnecessary candles to preserve them, leaving just one burning low on the table. "Yeah," he said, "because of her." He settled back against the couch, the sleeping bag over his legs, and he meant to stay awake. He was the oldest, he was the one in charge. Staying awake was what being in charge meant. But the warmth from the heater and the full stomach and the particular deep exhaustion of a man who has held other people together through a crisis and can now for just a moment put that down. He did not quite sleep. He drifted. And from the kitchen, he could hear very faintly Maggie moving. Not going to sleep. Not settling in. Moving. He cracked one eye and saw her in the doorway looking out at the 5 men in her living room. She was checking on them, one by one, the way you check on family. He closed his eye. He heard her set something down, he thought, from the soft scraping sound that it was a bucket positioned under the leak in the corner before the snow got heavy enough to matter. And then he heard her sit down. In the armchair next to Ray's, she'd pulled the smaller one close, and he heard the soft weight of a blanket settling over her. And then he heard nothing because she was the quietest person he had ever been in a room with, and she was apparently going to spend the night in a chair so that her unexpected guests could have the better spots. He started to get up. He decided not to. She hadn't asked for his help. She hadn't asked for anything. And some people, he had met very few of them in his life, but he recognized them when he saw them, and people carried their dignity in a very specific way, and you honored that dignity by letting them carry it. So he let her. Outside, the storm was at its worst. Now the wind screaming across Maple Terrace, driving the snow, horizontal, bearing the street, bearing the town, bearing everything that had been visible and familiar, under white and cold and silence. Inside the small wooden house, 6 people breathed and slept and drifted, held together by bean soup and borrowed blankets, and one woman's unshakable, unasked for, unperformative belief that the right thing to do and the hard thing to do were usually the same thing, and that this had never once been a reason not to do it. The candle on the kitchen table burned low and steady. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, something else was happening, something that didn't have a simple name yet. But Garrett Sullivan, half asleep on an old woman's living room floor in a dying Ohio town, his leather notebook in his jacket pocket, with her name written on a fresh page, Garrett Sullivan felt it settling into him like a coal finding its place at the center of a fire. And he knew with the absolute certainty of a man who has made a career out of recognizing things that matter that this night was not going to end when the storm did. Maggie woke before any of them. She always had. 51 years of marriage to a mill worker who started his shift at 5:30 had calibrated something deep inside her. Some internal clock that no amount of retirement or widowhood or quiet had ever managed to reset. Her eyes opened in the dark, and she knew immediately before she checked, before she moved, before the full weight of the previous night settled back into her conscious mind, that the storm had broken. It was the silence that told her. Not complete silence, but the particular quality of silence that comes after violence, the held breath quiet of a world that has exhausted itself and is now simply sitting with what it's done. The wind had stopped. The windows had stopped rattling. The house had stopped its long, anxious groaning against the pressure outside. She sat up carefully in the armchair, feeling every one of her 72 years in the specific geography of her spine, and she looked at the room. 5 men, all of them asleep. Marcus in the kitchen chair, his injured arms still elevated on the stack of Raymond's paperbacks. His head dropped to his chest, his breathing slow and even. Big Ray in the armchair across from her, the white bandage still clean on his forehead, his massive hands folded in his lap like a man in a church pew. Danny on the floor on his side, completely swaddled in his blanket, only the top of his head visible. Cole against the wall where he'd fallen asleep the night before, not having moved an inch, still and deep in the way only the truly exhausted sleep. And Garrett, he was on the floor near the heater, the sleeping bag pulled to his waist, and he was not quite asleep. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, it was the stillness of a man who was awake and thinking, but had decided to stay quiet. She'd known that stillness well. Raymond had had it too. The stillness of men who carry things. She stood without making a sound and went to the kitchen. She had 2 biscuits in the dish towel. She had eggs, half a carton. She had butter and a heel of bread, and the end of a jar of strawberry preserves that she'd been rationing for 2 weeks. She had coffee, actual coffee, the good kind, because coffee was the one thing she had never been willing to compromise on regardless of what the budget said. And Raymond had felt exactly the same way, and some arguments you just don't have with the dead. She started the coffee first. The gas burner caught with a soft blue hiss, and she set the pot on, and she stood there in her kitchen with Raymond's coat still around her shoulders, and she thought 6 people, 2 biscuits, half a carton of eggs. She started doing the math. The math was not encouraging. But Maggie Lawson had been doing discouraging math for most of her adult life, and she had learned that the answer is almost never as bad as the equation makes it look if you're willing to be creative and willing to stretch and willing to give yourself the smallest portion without making a production of it. She cracked all 6 eggs into the bowl. She was whisking them when she heard the floor creak behind her, and she turned and Garrett was standing in the kitchen doorway. The sleeping bag gone, his leather jacket back on his hair, not quite right from sleeping on the floor, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You should have woken me," he said, "to take a turn." "A turn at what?" she said, watching, making sure everyone was okay. She turned back to the eggs. "They were okay, I checked." "I know you did." A pause. "I heard you." She didn't say anything to that. He came into the kitchen and stood near the window. "Storm's done," he said. "I know. Roads are going to be a mess. Probably be a few hours before anyone can get through." He was quiet for a moment. "Our bikes are on Highway 44, about a mile out. I figured. I need to make some calls as soon as I get signal." "There's higher ground on the east side," she said, still whisking, still not looking at him. "About 3 blocks. Sometimes you get signal there even when the rest of town doesn't. Rita Mendoza up there had signal last ice storm, I remember, because she called to check on me, and I could hear her fine." He was quiet again. She could feel him watching her. "Mrs. Lawson," he said. "Maggie." "Maggie." He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "What do you need right now, this morning? What do you actually need?" She stopped whisking. She set the bowl down on the counter, and she turned and looked at him straight on the way she'd looked at all 5 of them the night before with those steady eyes that didn't perform anything they didn't mean. "I need the eggs not to stick," she said. "You want to make yourself useful, you can get that pan off the hook and put some butter in it." Something moved across his face. She thought it might have been the closest thing to relief she'd ever seen on a man who clearly didn't allow himself relief very often. He got the pan, he put the butter in, and they made breakfast together in her kitchen in the gray morning light. Not talking much, but talking some. She told him about the mill closing, just the facts of it, no editorializing the way you talk about weather or history, things that happened and shaped the land and then were simply done. He listened the way that certain people listen, with his whole attention, without interrupting, without offering opinions that hadn't been asked for. She didn't ask him what he did for work. She didn't ask him about the club or the patches or the bikes. She asked him if he took sugar in his coffee, and when he said yes, she gave him the last of the sugar without hesitation and took hers black. By the time the eggs were done, Danny was awake. Danny apparently woke up the way a light switch works all at once and at full brightness, and he came into the kitchen doorway and stopped and stared. "Is that coffee?" he said. "Actual coffee." "It is," Maggie said. "I will cry," he said. "I want you to know that's a real possibility." "Cups are in the second cabinet," she said. "Get one for yourself and one for anyone else who's up." He got 4 cups. All of them were up within 10 minutes. They ate at the kitchen table, all 6 of them crowded around a table that had been built for 2 elbows, touching the mismatched bowls and cups deployed again without ceremony. The eggs divided into 6 careful portions, and the 2 biscuits broken into pieces and passed around, and nobody took more than their share, and nobody commented on the smallness of it, because they all understood, even the ones who might not have understood it yesterday, that this was everything she had, and she was giving it without reservation. Marcus ate left-handed with the concentration of someone learning a new language. Maggie watched him for a moment, and then quietly repositioned his cup to the left side of his plate without saying anything. He looked at her. She'd already looked away. "Can I ask you something?" Cole said. He was talking to Maggie. He had the careful manner of a man who wasn't entirely sure how the question was going to come out. "You can ask," she said. "Last night, when you opened the door," he paused, organizing it, "you saw us. You know what we looked like, what we the patches, all of it, and you just..." He stopped. Tried again. "What went through your head right at that moment?" The table went quiet, even Danny. Maggie set down her coffee cup. She thought about it, really thought about it, not reaching for the easy answer, not performing humility or bravery or anything else. She was just looking for the true answer, which is always the only one worth saying. I saw men who were cold, she said finally, and hurt, and out of road. She picked her cup back up. The rest of it, what you're wearing, what people think about what you're wearing, that's not mine to sort out. That's between you and the rest of the world. My part was just the door. Cole stared at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his plate, and he nodded once, and he didn't say anything else, but his jaw was working in the way jaws work when a man is holding something back that he's not sure how to let out in polite company. Garrett had been watching all of this from his end of the table. He picked up the leather notebook he'd apparently had it on him even at breakfast, which told Maggie something about the kind of man he was, and he opened it and wrote something, and she didn't ask what. After breakfast, they helped her clean up. She tried to wave them off, and they didn't wave. Garrett washed. Ray dried, moving carefully with his head wound, but refusing to be treated like an invalid about it. Danny swept the kitchen floor without being asked, which Maggie noticed and didn't comment on, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Cole found the bucket in the corner that had caught the overnight drip from the roof and emptied it into the sink without a word and put it back in exactly the right position. Marcus sat at the table because his arm wouldn't let him do otherwise, and he talked to Maggie while the others worked. He was from Cleveland, originally, he told her, moved to Columbus for work. His mother was still in Cleveland, getting older, lived alone since his father passed 3 years ago. You check on her, Maggie asked. Every Sunday, he said. Call every Sunday without fail. Visit when I can. She nodded. Good boy, she said simply, in the way she said it, not condescending, just matter of fact. The way you'd confirm something accurate made him sit up a little straighter. Garrett got signal on the East Hill at 9:15. He made calls Maggie didn't ask to whom, and came back 40 minutes later and told his men that a truck was coming for the bikes, that it would take most of the day, that there were arrangements being made. What arrangements, he didn't say. What Maggie noticed was that after he came back from the hill, he stood in the middle of her living room and looked at it, really looked at it in a way he hadn't the night before, because the night before they had all been too cold and too desperate to look at anything with full attention. Now he looked at the ceiling with its water-stained corner and the bucket still sitting underneath, at the windows where the cold came through in thin, searching streams despite the rolled towels, at the walls where the paint had given up in several places and the wood beneath showed through, at the kerosene heater that was the only heat source in the house. He looked at all of it, and his expression didn't show pity, which was the thing Maggie would have reacted badly to. It showed something colder and more purposeful, something that in a business context would have been called assessment. She saw him looking, and she said quietly and without apology, "It's old." The house, not me, although both, I suppose. How long's the furnace been out, he asked. Since October. Something shifted in his eyes, fast controlled, gone before most people would have caught it. October, he repeated. I've managed, she said, and then because she wasn't interested in being managed about it. The kerosene does the job. I keep the bedroom door closed and sleep with enough blankets. It's fine. It's February, he said. I know what month it is, she said pleasantly, but with complete finality, and he heard the finality and he let it go, for now. Around noon, Big Ray found the porch steps. Specifically, he found the one that was broken, had been broken, Maggie would later admit, for about 8 months by stepping on it wrong, on his way back from helping push snow off the front walk, which he had done without asking and without fanfare. And the step had given way under his weight, and he'd caught himself on the railing and stood there looking down at the broken board with an expression of profound personal offense. Mrs. Lawson, he called. Maggie, she called back from inside. This step, I know. You walk on this every day. I walk around it every day, she said. It's not the same thing. There was a pause, then Danny, Cole, come here. Maggie came to the door and looked out at what was happening. Big Ray had apparently decided that the step was a problem that needed to be solved immediately and completely, and he had communicated this decision to Danny and Cole, who had apparently agreed without requiring much persuasion. The three of them were conferring with the concentrated energy of men who have found something constructive to do with their hands and are deeply grateful for it. You don't have to, she started. We've got time, Ray said, not looking up. Truck's not here till this afternoon. Cole, see if there's a board in that garage. Danny checked the porch for loose nails we can reuse. I don't have much in the garage, Maggie said. Let me look, Cole said, already heading around the side of the house. She stood in the doorway and watched them. She wanted to say something, wanted to explain that she didn't need this, didn't need any of this, had been handling her own house and her own broken steps and her own leaking roof and her own cold winter for 11 years without assistance, and would continue to do so, and she couldn't say any of it. Because watching Big Ray, who had a fresh head wound and a night of hard floor behind him, get down on his knees on a freezing porch to fix a broken step for a woman he had known for less than 12 hours. Something in her throat made the words impossible. She went back inside. Garrett was sitting in the armchair, Ray's armchair, from the night before, and he was writing in the notebook again. And he looked up when she came in, and she could see on her face that she was holding something back, and he said nothing, which was the right call. She sat down across from him. The sounds of work came through the door, the crack and pull of old wood. Voices, a short burst of laughter from Danny about something, Cole's lower voice answering. They don't have to do that, she said, not complaining, just saying. I know, Garrett said. They want to. She was quiet for a moment. Why? He considered the question with the same seriousness she'd applied to Cole's question at breakfast. Because last night you treated them like people, he said. Not like something to be afraid of. Not like something to be tolerated. Like people. He paused. You'd be surprised how rare that is. She looked at him. That's not a compliment, she said. That's just an indictment. He blinked. Treating people like people shouldn't be rare, she said. That's just the floor. That's the lowest bar there is. The fact that it surprises anybody. She stopped, shook her head. Raymond used to say the same thing. He'd come home from somewhere and say, Maggie, someone was genuinely kind to me today. Like it was news. And I always wanted to say, shouldn't that just be Tuesday? Shouldn't that just be the way? Garrett was very still. It should, he said, and then after a moment, it doesn't always work out that way. No, she said, it doesn't. She picked up her coffee cup, realized it was empty, set it down again. But that's not a reason to stop expecting it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the notebook and he wrote something, and he closed it, and he looked at her with something in his face that wasn't quite gratitude, and wasn't quite respect, and wasn't quite something you could name, but was all of those things pulling in the same direction. The truck arrived at 3 in the afternoon, 2 of them actually large, professional-looking, unmarked. They came with a crew of 4 men who clearly knew what they were doing and did it quickly and efficiently and without any of the uncertainty of improvisation. Within an hour, the bikes were loaded, the crew was packed up, and the 2 trucks were idling on Maple Terrace. It was time. Maggie stood on her porch on the fixed porch steps, steady under her feet now for the first time in 8 months, and she looked at the 5 of them lined up on her front walk like students at an end-of-term photo. Danny was grinning. Cole looked like he was trying not to look emotional and was losing the battle. Ray had his hand pressed carefully to the clean bandage on his head, not because it hurt, Maggie thought, but because he'd forgotten he was doing it. Marcus had his arm in a proper sling. One of the crew members had apparently brought a first aid kit that put Maggie's to shame, and he was looking at her with those young eyes that had something permanently changed in them from the night before. And Garrett stood slightly apart the way leaders stand, the leather notebook nowhere visible, but Maggie knew it was there in his inside pocket with her name on a fresh page. You didn't eat enough this morning, she told them, because it was the true thing she wanted to say, and she was constitutionally incapable of not saying true things. Any of you, I want you to stop somewhere and eat a real meal. Yes, ma'am, Marcus said immediately. And Marcus, she looked at him directly, you get that arm x-rayed today, not tomorrow. Today. Yes, ma'am. Ray, if that wound starts bleeding again. Hospital, Ray said. I know. She looked at Danny. Don't drive too fast. I'm not even driving today, he said. We're in the trucks. Then don't ride too fast later, when you're back on the bikes. Yes, ma'am. He was still grinning, but his eyes were bright. She looked at Cole last. He was looking right back at her, and she could see his jaw working again the same way it had at breakfast, and she made it easy for him. You call your grandmother, she said. Whoever she is, wherever she is, you call her. He nodded. Fast just once the way you nod when speaking isn't currently an option. Then she looked at Garrett. He looked back at her. Thank you, he said. And the word, the simple, ordinary, insufficient word, came out of him with a weight that told her he had been carrying it since the night before and was only now setting it down. For the door, for the soup, for he stopped. Started again, for all of it. It was just a door, she said. No, he said quietly. It wasn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, you come back through Ridgemont, you stop. I'll have biscuits. Real ones, not the survival kind. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face. He nodded. He turned. He walked to the truck. And one by one, the others followed him, each of them looking back once, just once, before they got in as if they were fixing something in their memory that they didn't want to lose. The trucks pulled away. The street was quiet. Maggie stood on her fixed porch steps and watched until the trucks turned the corner and disappeared, and then she stood there a little longer, just because she could. Just because the morning air was cold and sharp, and the sky, after the storm, had that particular clean quality it gets when everything has been washed and reset and the world is briefly and probably new. She turned and went back inside. She sat down in her armchair. The house was the same house. The ceiling still had its stain. The windows still had their drafts. The kerosene heater clicked in the corner, doing its patient, inadequate best. Everything was exactly the same, and nothing was. She reached over and picked up Raymond's old coat from where she'd left it, folded on the arm of the chair, and she held it in her lap, the way you hold something that is both past and present at the same time. And she said to Raymond, who was 11 years gone, but still somehow in every room of this house, she said quietly, you would have liked them. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up, because there were things to do, and Maggie Lawson had never been a woman who sat with anything for too long when there were still things to do. She couldn't know that at that exact moment in the cab of a large, unmarked truck heading north on a cleared highway, Garrett Sullivan had the leather notebook open on his knee. And underneath her name, and underneath the words, the only light on the street, he was writing 3 more words, pressing the pen down with the deliberate firmness of a man making a decision he intends to keep. Those 3 words were do not forget. He underlined them once. He closed the notebook. And he looked out the window at the Ohio sky, clean and cold and new, and he began to think. 3 weeks passed. Maggie didn't think about them every day. That wasn't entirely true. She thought about Marcus's arm, whether he'd gotten it x-rayed like she'd told him to. She thought about Ray's head wound, whether it had closed clean or needed stitches after all. She thought about Cole, wondered if he'd called his grandmother. These were the thoughts of a woman who had spent a lifetime caring about people after they left her orbit, the same way you think about whether a plant you watered once is still getting enough sun. She didn't expect anything. That was important to understand about Maggie Lawson. She did not operate on the expectation of return. She had given what she had to give on Valentine's night, because that was what the moment required, and the moment was over now. And she had gone back to her life, the bean soup and the kerosene heater and the Tuesday Social Security deposit and the leaking corner of the ceiling and the quiet that Raymond had left behind him like a second presence in every room. She had gone back to being visible. Dorothy Fenwick stopped her on the sidewalk 8 days after the storm in that particular way Dorothy had of stopping people that made it clear she had information and intended to deploy it. I heard, Dorothy said, dropping her voice to the register she reserved for things she found simultaneously scandalous and thrilling, that you let those motorcycle people into your house. I did, Maggie said. Dorothy waited for more. Maggie didn't provide it. Maggie, those were Hell's Angels. They were men who were freezing to death, Maggie said pleasantly. Good seeing you, Dorothy. She walked on. Dorothy called after her, you could have been killed. Maggie raised one hand in a wave without turning around and kept walking. She thought about that conversation later, sitting in Raymond's chair with her coffee. You could have been killed. She'd been turning that phrase over in her mind for 3 weeks, looking at it from different angles, trying to understand the arithmetic of it. Yes, she could have been. She could also have been killed, crossing the street, or by the carbon monoxide from the kerosene heater if it malfunctioned, or by the cold itself if the heater gave out some night and she didn't wake up in time. Risk was everywhere. It was just a question of which risks you chose to take and which ones you let make your decisions for you. Maggie had stopped letting fear make her decisions sometime around her 45th year. She couldn't remember the exact moment. She just remembered that one day she'd realized that fear was very loud and very insistent and almost never right, and she'd started treating it like an alarm clock. She'd already heard, acknowledged, noted, and turned off. She was thinking about this, or maybe about Raymond, or maybe about nothing in particular when she heard the car. She heard it before she saw it, the sound of a vehicle moving slowly down Maple Terrace, which was unusual enough on an ordinary morning to make her look up from her coffee. The street didn't get much traffic. The through traffic that used to flow through Ridgemont had rerouted itself long ago, along with most of everything else. She heard it stop. She heard a car door. She heard footsteps on her porch. Not the shuffling, uncertain footsteps of someone who wasn't sure they had the right house, but the deliberate, measured footsteps of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had thought about this walk for a while. The knock was the same as before, 3 times. Heavy, deliberate. Maggie set down her coffee cup. She stood up. She crossed the room and she opened the door, and she was already speaking before she fully processed what she was seeing. "I said come back when you were passing through, not—" She stopped. Because it wasn't the Garrett Sullivan she'd put into a sleeping bag on her living room floor 3 weeks ago. It was the same man, same silver beard, same quiet eyes, same way of holding himself, like he was the fixed point in whatever room he occupied, but everything else was different. The clothes were different. Not dressed up exactly, but put together in the way of a man who has options about how he presents himself and has made considered choices this morning. Behind him on the street was a black SUV, large new, with a particular anonymous quality of professional vehicles. And beside the SUV stood 2 other men in dark coats, who were clearly not there for a casual visit. Maggie looked at all of this. She looked at Garrett. "You better come in," she said. He came in alone. The 2 men stayed by the SUV, which told Maggie something she filed away without yet knowing what to do with it. He sat in the same armchair he'd sat in the night of the storm, which Maggie noticed and thought was either habit or intention, and she sat across from him and she said, "Talk." He almost smiled. "You don't want coffee first. I want to know why you came back with a security detail," she said. "Then maybe coffee." He was quiet for a moment. Just a moment, the pause of a man choosing his words, not because he's unsure what he means, but because he understands that how you say something shapes what it becomes. "My name is Garrett Sullivan," he said. "You know that part." "I do." "What you don't know," he said, "is that I'm the founder and CEO of Trident Holdings. We're a logistics company. We operate in 14 states. Revenue last year was—" He stopped. "The number isn't what matters. What matters is that I'm not what I looked like on your porch 3 weeks ago." Maggie looked at him steadily. "What did you look like on my porch 3 weeks ago?" "Someone who needed help," he said. "That's what you were," she said. "That's still what you are at the end of it. Everybody is one way or another." She paused. "Are you telling me you're wealthy?" "Yes." "Very wealthy." A slight pause. "Yes." She absorbed this. Her expression didn't change in the way most people's expressions change when they receive this kind of information. No sudden recalibration, no widening of the eyes, no reassessment, flickering visibly across the face. She just sat with it the same way she sat with everything, squarely and without drama. "The ride," she said, "the motorcycles. That's not what your life looks like normally." "It's what it looks like every February 14th, he said. "There was a man, his name was Joe Briggs. He was my first business partner. My closest friend for 20 years. He died 4 years ago, cancer fast and bad, less than 6 months from diagnosis to gone." His voice stayed level, but there was something behind the levelness, something he was keeping contained, the way you keep a fire contained, not by pretending it isn't there, but by maintaining the structure around it. Joe loved to ride. That was his thing from the time he was 17 years old. Every Valentine's Day, he'd take his bike out, regardless of weather, regardless of everything, because his wife had died on Valentine's Day. Different year, fine, long before I knew him. And riding was how he processed things he couldn't process any other way. Garrett paused. "After he died, I started doing the ride. In his name. The men who come with me, they all knew Joe. It's our way of keeping him." Maggie sat with that for a moment. "What was he like?" she asked. Garrett looked at her with the slightly startled expression of a man who had prepared for many questions and not this one. "He was stubborn," he said, and something softened in his face, something real. "Stubborn and loud, and the most loyal person I ever knew. He could argue any side of any argument. He remembered every birthday. He once drove 4 hours in a snowstorm to help a junior employee move apartments because the kid mentioned offhandedly that his back hurt." He paused. "He would have liked you." Maggie's breath caught, just slightly, because that was exactly what she had said to Raymond's coat 3 weeks ago, sitting in this same chair. You would have liked them. I think I would have liked him too, she said. Garrett nodded. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, and yes, the notebook was there. She'd been right, it was always there, but he didn't take out the notebook. He took out an envelope and he set it on the table between them. I want to help, he said. The furnace, the roof, the steps. I see Ray fixed the one step, but the rest of them need work too. The windows. All of it. I want to do this properly. Maggie looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. No, she said. Maggie. No, she said again, and her voice was kind and completely immovable. I didn't open my door for payment. I didn't feed you for payment. If that's what this is, you can take it back and we'll still be friends and I'll still make the biscuits, but I won't take money for doing what was right. Garrett leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped, his eyes direct. It's not payment, he said. I want to be clear about that. Payment implies a transaction, and what you did wasn't a transaction. You didn't give us something in exchange for something else. You just gave. He paused. This isn't payment. This is I'm trying to find the right word. Charity, she said, and the word landed flat. No, he said it firmly. Not charity either. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working it out in real time, not performing the search, but actually conducting it. Continuation, he said finally. You started something that night. You showed 5 people. 5 people who, believe me, have seen more than enough of the world to have gotten cynical about it. You showed them that it's still possible. That kindness is still a thing that exists without an agenda behind it. He held her gaze. I want to continue that, not give it back to you. Continue it. Into this street, this town, these people. Maggie was very still. What does that mean exactly, she said. It means I want to fix your house, he said. Not as a favor to you personally, as the beginning of something larger. He opened the notebook then, and she could see it was filled with his small, precise handwriting, pages of it dense and deliberate. I've been doing research on Ridgemont for 3 weeks. The mill closure, the population loss, the infrastructure. There are 63 families still on this street alone. A third of them have some version of what you have, heating issues, structural problems, no resources to fix them. He looked up. I want to address that, not write a check and walk away. Actually address it. Contractors, materials, labor, people who live here, hired to fix houses here. A community kitchen somewhere people can come for a meal without shame. A scholarship fund for the kids who are still here and still have somewhere to go. He paused. And I want your name on it. The room was very quiet. My name, she said, the kitchen, the program, whatever we call it, I want your name on it. Because it started with you. Because what exists in this town 3 years from now, if we do this right, starts from a woman who opened a door on Valentine's night when nobody else would. Maggie stood up. She walked to the kitchen and she came back with 2 cups of coffee, and she set one in front of him, and she sat back down and she wrapped both hands around her own cup, and she looked at him over the rim of it for a long measuring moment. Raymond, what she said. What? My husband, Raymond Arthur Lawson. If you put my name on anything, his name goes with it. He was here for 40 years before I was alone. Whatever this place is, he's part of it. She took a sip of coffee. That's my condition. The only one. Garrett picked up his coffee cup. Done, he said. Just like that. Just like that. She studied him. You're a man who makes decisions fast. I'm a man who made this decision 3 weeks ago, he said. I've just been working out the details. She set her cup down. She looked at the envelope still sitting on the table between them, still untouched. What's in there? The first proposal, he said. Contractors, timeline, scope of work. Your house first. Then the street. Then the wider plan. He paused. Nothing happens without your agreement. Nothing. You tell me to stop at your front door, we stop at your front door. She reached out and picked up the envelope. She held it in both hands, turned it over once. She didn't open it yet, she just held it the way she'd held Raymond's coat that morning. 3 weeks ago, feeling the weight of it, feeling what it represented, all the possible futures folded up inside a plain white envelope. There are children on this street, she said quietly. Couple of families, both parents working 2 jobs. Kids coming home to empty houses after school. I've been feeding them when I can. 3, sometimes 4 kids, 3 or 4 days a week. I know, Garrett said. Marcus told me. He remembered you mentioning it the morning after. She looked up sharply. He remembered that. He remembered everything you said that morning. A pause. We all did. She looked back round at the envelope. Something was shifting in her face now. Not breaking, Maggie Lawson didn't break, but moving the way. Plates deep underground moved slow and enormous and permanently. Rita Mendoza, she said, up on the East Hill. She's 78 and her boiler is shot, and she's been using her oven for heat, which is dangerous, and she knows it, and she can't afford to do anything else. Write her name down, Garrett said, and he held out the notebook. She looked at the notebook, then at him. Then she took it, and she took the pen he offered, and she wrote Rita Mendoza's name in her own careful handwriting on a fresh page, and underneath it, she wrote the address from memory. The Paulson boy, she said, still writing. He's 22, grew up on this street, graduated top of his class, can't afford college. Smart as a whip. His mama cried when she told me. Write it down. She wrote it down. The church on 4th Street lost their furnace in November. Pastor Williams has been holding services in his coat. Write it down. She filled half a page. Names, addresses, situations, all of it from memory, all of it carried in her head with the same careful organization she applied to her linen closet and her kitchen cabinets, because Maggie Lawson had spent years paying attention to a town that had stopped paying attention to itself, and she had been keeping the record when no one else was. When she stopped writing, she handed the notebook back to him, and he looked at the page, and he was quiet for a moment. You've been carrying all of this, he said. Someone had to, she said. The same thing she'd said about staying in Ridgemont. Because to Maggie, the two things were the same thing. You stayed, you paid attention, you carried what needed carrying until someone else could help you put it down. Garrett closed the notebook. He looked at her with that expression again, the one that wasn't gratitude and wasn't respect and wasn't any single named emotion, but was all of them converging in the same direction. I need to ask you something, he said, and I want you to think about it before you answer. All right. Will you work with me on this, not as a recipient, as a partner? You know this town, you know these people, you know what's needed and what's not needed, and what well-meaning outside money gets wrong when it comes into a place like this without listening first. He held her gaze. I don't want to come in here and fix things the wrong way. I want to do it right, and I can't do it right without you. The question sat between them. Maggie looked out the window. She could see Maple Terrace, the cracked sidewalks, and the empty houses with their boards and their broken gutters, and the 3 houses that still had lights in the windows, and the one street light that had been out since September, and the big oak at the corner that Raymond had watched go from a sapling to a giant over 50 years, and that was still standing when everything else had changed. She thought about Dorothy Fenwick telling her she could have been killed. She thought about the Paulson boy's mother crying. She thought about Rita Mendoza running her oven all winter. She thought about Raymond saying, Maggie, someone was genuinely kind to me today. Like it was news, like it was remarkable, like it was something that required reporting. She thought about what she'd said back. Shouldn't that just be Tuesday? She turned back to Garrett. I have conditions, she said. Name them. The people on this street are hired first. For the construction, work, the kitchen, all of it, but not brought in from outside. People who live here. Agreed. The kitchen is open to everybody. No applications, no means testing, no dignity tax. You walk in, you sit down, you eat. That's it. Agreed. Raymond's name is on the building, not a plaque in the corner. On the building. On the building, he said, front and center. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, when do we start? Something moved across Garrett Sullivan's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not in the blizzard, not in the morning after, not in the 3 weeks of planning and deciding that had brought him back to her door. It was simple and unguarded and entirely real. It was relief. Not the relief of a problem solved. The relief of a man who has been carrying something important very carefully for a long time and has finally found the right hands to help him carry it. Tomorrow, he said, if that's not too soon. I've been waiting 11 years, Maggie said. Tomorrow is fine. She picked up her coffee cup. He picked up his. And they sat in Raymond's living room in the quiet morning on Maple Terrace, the woman who had opened the door and the man who had walked through it, and they began to talk about what came next with the focused, practical energy of 2 people who understand that good intentions mean nothing without a plan, and that a plan means nothing without someone willing to do the work. Outside the street was exactly what it had always been, broken and cold and stubbornly, impossibly alive. And inside the small wooden house, Something was being built that the street didn't know yet it needed, but it was coming. It was already coming. The first contractor showed up at 7:15 the next morning. Maggie heard the truck before she saw it, the heavy diesel rumble of a work vehicle pulling onto Maple Terrace with purpose, which was a sound this street had not heard in a very long time. She was already dressed. She had been dressed since 6. She had made coffee, and she had sat at the kitchen table with the envelope Garrett had left, reading through the proposal for the third time, with the reading glasses she only wore when she was alone, because she was 72 years old and still vain about exactly one thing. She'd read every line, every contractor, name, every line item, every projected date, and she had made notes in the margin in her own handwriting because Maggie Lawson did not sign off on anything she hadn't interrogated completely. When she opened the door and saw the contractor, a broad-shouldered man named Dennis Yarrow, third-generation builder from just outside Youngstown, who shook her hand with the firm respect of someone who had been briefed on who he was meeting, she handed him the proposal with her margin notes and said, "I have questions about the roofing timeline on page 4. Come inside." Dennis Yarrow looked at the notes. He looked at her. He came inside. By 8 o'clock, they had revised the timeline. By 8:30, 2 more crew members had arrived, both of them from Ridgemont itself, men. Maggie recognized men who had grown up here and stayed and spent the last 5 years doing odd jobs and patchwork because that was all there was. Tommy Garrett, no relation to the other Garrett, which caused brief confusion, was 34 and had done construction work before the last local crew dissolved. His cousin Pete had done electrical. When Maggie saw Tommy and Pete climb out of Dennis Yarrow's truck, she stopped in the doorway. "You hired local," she said, not a question. Dennis nodded. Mr. Sullivan was specific about it. Anyone within a 20-mile radius who had the skills got the first call. These 2 were on the phone before I was. Tommy caught Maggie's eye and looked away fast, the way men look away when they're not sure they can hold an expression steady. He'd been out of steady work for 14 months. Maggie knew this because his mother Francine had told her in the bread aisle at the Gas and Go, the particular exhausted despair of a parent watching their child drown slowly in a town with no lifeboats. "Tommy," Maggie said, "Morning, Mrs. Lawson. Your mother know you're here." "Called her last night," he said. "She cried." Maggie nodded once, pressed her lips together, and said, "Good, get to work." The sound of construction on Maple Terrace drew people out of their houses, the way a scent draws animals cautiously. At first, then with more confidence, as it became clear the thing was real and not going away. Dorothy Fenwick came out at 9 ostensibly to check her mailbox, which she checked 3 more times over the course of the morning. Bill Harmon from across the street stood on his porch for 45 minutes, pretending to drink coffee. The Krishnamurthy family back from Youngstown watched from their window until Mrs. Krishnamurthy apparently decided watching was insufficient and came out to ask if anyone wanted tea. And when Maggie said yes, she came back with a full pot and a plate of something that smelled extraordinary. And Tommy Yarrow said it was the best thing he'd eaten since Christmas. By noon, Maple Terrace felt like a street that was awake, not fixed, not healed, not the thing it used to be or the thing it was trying to become. Just awake, paying attention. The lights on. Garrett arrived at 1 in the afternoon. No SUV this time, no security detail, just a regular truck, him driving Marcus in the passenger seat with his arm in a proper cast hospital, and set the day of just like Maggie had told him. He got out and looked at the activity on the street, and something in his face went very quiet in the way of a man absorbing something he'd hoped for, but hadn't entirely let himself expect. Marcus walked straight to Maggie and held up the cast. "Hospital," he said. "Same day, as instructed." "Good boy," she said, and he grinned like he was 12 years old. "It was broken, by the way," he said. "Clean fracture. Doctor said if I'd left it another day, it would have been significantly worse." "I know," Maggie said. "I could tell by the angle." He stared at her. "How could you tell by the angle?" 23 years of mill injuries," she said. "Raymond broke his wrist twice. I know a break when I see one." She looked at the cast. "Who signed it?" "Garrett. Danny drew a motorcycle on it, which I've been told is deeply inappropriate for a grown man." "Danny is correct that it's inappropriate," Maggie said. "That's why it's the right call." Marcus laughed, that same surprise laugh from the night of the storm, the one that cracked something open, and Maggie felt the warmth of it, the same way she'd felt it the first time, like something being confirmed that she'd suspected but needed to hear out loud. Garrett had been talking to Dennis Yarrow, reviewing progress. Now he crossed to where Maggie was standing, and he said without preamble, Rita Mendoza. What about her? Dennis has a crew going to her house tomorrow morning. New boiler, 2-day job. He paused. She doesn't know yet. I thought you might want to be the one to tell her. Maggie looked at him. I'll go this afternoon, she said. There's something else, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, not heavier, exactly, but more deliberate, the voice he used when he was about to say something he'd been working up to. The Paulson boy, James. What about him? I called the admissions office at Ohio State this morning. Maggie went very still. He's past the regular deadline for this year, Garrett continued. But there's a process for exceptional circumstances, and it turns out that when a named scholarship fund calls and says they have a candidate, the process moves somewhat faster than normal. He held her gaze. He'd have to apply. He'd have to do the work himself. I'm not buying him in, I want to be clear about that. But if he applies this week, and his grades are what his mother says they are, they're better, Maggie said. She undersells him because she doesn't want to jinx it. Then he has a real shot at starting in the fall. The word fall landed in Maggie's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples going out and out and out. This September, James Paulson, who had been coming to Maggie's back door for potato soup since he was 9 years old, who had done his homework at her kitchen table when the heat in his own house was unreliable, who had graduated at the top of his class and then spent 8 months stocking shelves at the Gas and Go because there was nothing else. James Paulson going to college in the fall. His mother, Maggie said, and her voice was not entirely steady. Does she know? Not yet. Same reason. Thought you should be there. Maggie put her hand over her mouth for just a moment. 1 moment. Then she dropped it and straightened and said, You're going to make me cry in front of all these people, and I'm going to be very annoyed about it. I can tell you later if you'd prefer. Don't you dare. He almost smiled. She almost did too. That afternoon, Maggie walked to Rita Mendoza's house on the East Hill, and she knocked on the door, and Rita answered in her coat, her actual winter coat inside her own home in March, and Maggie said without any preamble, because Rita Mendoza was not a woman who benefited from preamble. There's a crew coming tomorrow morning to install a new boiler. 7:30. You don't have to do anything except let them in. Rita stared at her. Rita was 78 and Cuban-born and had survived things that made an Ohio winter look like a mild inconvenience, and she was not easily rattled. But she was rattled now. What? She said. New boiler, Maggie said. Tomorrow, 7:30. Maggie, that costs, it's handled. By who? By someone who owes this street a debt, Maggie said. And before you say anything about charity, I'll tell you what I told him. It's not charity, it's continuation. You've been holding this hill together for 30 years, Rita. You walked Dorothy Fenwick's kids to school every morning for 5 years when Dorothy was sick. You started the food pantry at the church in 1987. You've been doing exactly what I've been doing, just at your end of town. Maggie held her gaze. This is not charity. This is the world finally catching up. Rita Mendoza, who had not cried when she left Cuba, who had not cried when her husband of 34 years died of a heart attack in the driveway, who had not cried through 8 Ohio winters with a boiler that barely worked. Rita Mendoza stood in her own doorway, in her own coat, and she cried. Maggie let her. She stood there, and she let it happen because some things need to be cried, and trying to stop them is just postponing. Then Rita wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, 7:30 is too early. Rita, 8 o'clock, Rita said firmly. I need my coffee first. I'll tell them 8, Maggie said. She walked to the Paulson house next. Francine Paulson opened the door and looked at Maggie, the way people look when they've learned that unexpected visits can go either way. And Maggie said, Is James home? He's at work. He's on until 6. Francine paused. Is everything okay? Everything is better than okay, Maggie said. Can I come in and tell you something? She told her. She watched Francine Paulson's face go through 6 different expressions in approximately 4 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, hope, terror of the hope, and then something that could only be described as the emotional equivalent of a dam breaking. Francine grabbed Maggie's hands in both of hers and said, Is this real? Maggie, is this actually real? It's real, Maggie said. He has to apply. He has to do the work. But it's real. Francine made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Call him, Maggie said. Call him right now. Tell him to come home after work and sit down with you and fill out that application tonight. Don't wait. Don't think about it. Tonight. Tonight, Francine repeated like she was memorizing it. Tonight, Maggie said. She walked home in the early evening, the sky going pink and cold above Maple Terrace, the sound of the construction crew, finishing up for the day, carrying down the street in the clean, purposeful way that working sounds carry when the work is real. She walked past the houses she'd known for 50 years, some dark, some lit, some in between. And she thought about Raymond, who had walked the same street for 40 of those years, who had known every crack in every sidewalk, who had shoveled snow for 3 houses on either side without being asked, and fixed Mrs. Petrova's fence gate in '98, and coached Tommy Yarrow's Little League team in 2003, back when Tommy was 8 years old, and the town was still alive enough to have a Little League. She thought, Raymond, you would not believe this week. She thought, actually, you would believe it exactly. You'd say, finally. Took long enough. She was still thinking about this when she got home and found Garrett sitting on her porch steps, the fixed porch steps, solid under him, waiting for her. You didn't have to wait, she said. I know. He stood. How'd it go? Rita pushed the time to 8 o'clock. Good call. And Francine Paulson is calling James right now. She paused. You did a good thing today. We did, he said. You're the one who wrote the names down. She looked at him for a moment. The kitchen, she said. When does that start? Permits are filed. If everything moves on schedule. He hesitated. 8 weeks, maybe 10. And the name Raymond and Margaret Lawson Community Kitchen, he said. It's already on the permit application. She had to look away for a moment. Just a moment. When she looked back, she said he never wanted anything named after him. He'd have complained about it. Good thing he's not here to stop us, Garrett said. She laughed. An actual laugh, sudden and unguarded and real. The laugh of a woman who has been surprised by joy, which is the best kind of surprise there is. It came out of her like something that had been waiting for exactly the right key, and it changed the whole temperature of the porch. And Garrett looked at her when she laughed with the expression of a man who has just seen something he intends to remember. 6 weeks later, the kitchen wasn't open yet. 2 more weeks to go, but the building was done, and Maggie stood inside it for the first time on a Tuesday morning with Garrett and Dennis Yarrow and Tommy Yarrow and Pete and Marcus, whose cast was off, and Rita Mendoza, who had driven herself down from the East Hill and walked in like she owned the place, and then touched the countertops with the reverent hands of a woman who understands what has been made possible. And there above the front door, in letters that were the right size, not too small to miss, not so large, they were shouting, were the words Raymond and Margaret Lawson Community Kitchen, Ridgemont, Ohio. Maggie stood underneath it and looked up at it. She had been alone for 11 years. She had fed people in secret and fixed what she could and carried the names in her head and kept one candle burning and asked nothing from anyone because asking had always felt like a confession of failure. And she had never once thought that what she was doing was anything other than the most basic, obvious, unavoidable human obligation. She had not thought she was building something. She had just thought she was doing what needed doing. But standing there looking at Raymond's name and her own name above a door that was going to feed people real, people, she knew people who would walk in without paperwork and without shame and sit down at a table and eat. She understood something that she hadn't been able to see from inside it. She had been building something all along. Every bowl of soup, every child at her kitchen table doing homework, every name memorized and carried, every door opened in the dark. It had all been building towards something, even when she couldn't see the structure, even when it looked like nothing but small repeated acts of stubborn, ordinary kindness. It had always been building toward this. Raymond, she said very quietly, not sad, just present, just acknowledging that he was there the way he was always there in every room she occupied, in the specific weight of his coat on the hook by the door, in the way she made coffee, in the way she folded blankets, in the way she had raised their daughter, and the way she had stayed when everyone else left. She felt Garrett step up beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there looking up at the name with her, and that was the exactly right thing to do. Then he said, Cole called his grandmother. She looked at him. The week after the storm, he said, called her for the first time in 2 years. He told me last month. He went to see her in April. She lives in Kentucky. He says she cried for 10 minutes when he walked through the door. Maggie pressed her lips together. Danny, Garrett continued, started volunteering at a soup kitchen in Columbus. He didn't tell me. I found out because Marcus told me, And Marcus found out because Danny showed up to help and apparently listed me as a reference, which means the kitchen coordinator called my office to confirm. He paused. I did not give my permission to be listed as a reference. I confirmed it anyway. And Big Ray, she asked. Ray went back to school, Garrett said. Online business degree. He's 46 years old and doing homework on Saturday nights and complaining about it constantly. A pause. He asked me to tell you. She had to look at the ceiling for a moment. It was a good ceiling. Dennis Yarrow's crew had built it well. And Marcus, she managed. Marcus starts physical therapy next week for the arm. He's fine. Garrett paused. He also calls you Mrs. Lawson to everyone he talks to. Like the way people use a name when they want you to understand that the person it belongs to matters. The kitchen opening happened on a Wednesday morning in early May, and 43 people came through the door that first day. Not all at once, they came in ones and twos tentatively, the way people approach something they want but have been conditioned to expect a catch from. There was no catch. There was soup, real soup made from scratch by Rita Mendoza and Francine Paulson, and two other women from the street who had been recruited by the simple method of Maggie asking them and them saying yes. There was bread, there was coffee, the good kind, because Maggie had been absolutely immovable on that point. People sat down, people ate. A woman named Carol, who had been too proud to take anything from anyone for 3 years, sat in the corner by herself and ate a full bowl of chicken soup, and then another. And when she left, she touched Maggie's arm at the door and didn't say anything. And Maggie squeezed her hand and didn't say anything either, because some things are complete without words. James Paulson came in at noon. He was wearing his Gas N Go shirt, still on shift, technically on his lunch break, and he sat down across from Maggie, and he said, I got the acceptance letter this morning. She put down her spoon. Ohio State, he said, and his voice was doing something complicated. Full scholarship, starting in August. He looked at her the way young people look at the people who believed in them before they believed in themselves, with a kind of awe that is also a kind of debt, that also is also a kind of love, all three at once, indistinguishable. Mrs. Lawson, I don't know how to. Don't thank me, she said. I have to thank you. You did the work, she said. I just made sure someone was looking. That's different. He shook his head. He didn't agree, but he let her have it because he understood, even at 22, he understood that this woman was not going to accept credit for what she'd done, and that the best thing he could do was carry it forward the way she'd carried everything forward, quietly and without making a production of it. I'm going to study education, he said. I want to teach. Maybe come back here and teach. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. Good, she said simply. This street could use a teacher. On the first anniversary of the storm, 5 motorcycles came down Maple Terrace on Valentine's Day. Not stranded, not desperate, not bleeding and frozen and out of road. They came deliberate and expected and welcomed, rolling. Slow down a street that looked different now. Not transformed, not glossy, not the kind of renewal that erases what came before, but tended the way a garden looks when someone has been giving it real attention. The porch steps were fixed. The street light on the corner was working. Rita Mendoza's house had heat. The kitchen at the end of the block had its name above the door, and its lights on and its door open. Maggie stood on her porch and watched them come. Garrett parked first. Then Marcus cast free, both hands on the bars. Then Cole, who had called his grandmother and driven to Kentucky, and who carried himself slightly differently now, like a man who has put something down that he didn't realize he'd been holding. Then Danny, who was and would always be Danny, who pulled up and immediately pointed at the kitchen sign and said something to the others that made all of them laugh loud and unself-conscious on a cold February morning on a street that had almost forgotten what that sounded like. Then Big Ray, who had somehow gotten larger or maybe just more present, the kind of presence that comes when a person starts investing in themselves and the investment starts compounding. They came up her porch steps, all 5 of them. Maggie had biscuits, real ones, not the survival kind. She had coffee. She had the kitchen 50 yards down the street full of people and food, and a Wednesday that felt against all reasonable expectation like something worth having. Garrett stopped in front of her. He reached into his jacket. He pulled out the leather notebook, the same one worn now at the corners, and he opened it, and he showed her the first page he'd written her name on 12 months ago. Margaret Lawson, Maple Terrace, Ridgemont, Ohio, the only light on the street. He turned the page. The next 20 pages were full names and addresses and notes and dates and outcomes, all of it in his small, precise hand, the record of everything that had grown from one February night and one open door. I keep adding to it, he said. She looked at the pages, all those names, all those people, all those small, irreversible things set in motion. She looked up at him. You should get a bigger notebook, she said. He laughed. Marcus laughed. Cole and Danny and Ray laughed. And Maggie Lawson, 72 years old, broke on Valentine's night a year ago, and still not rich and never going to be, and completely at peace with that, laughed with them on her fixed front porch on Maple Terrace in Ridgemont, Ohio, while the kitchen with her husband's name on it fed people down the street in the streetlight that had been dark for months burned steady at the corner. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for the world to notice them. Maggie Lawson had spent hers making sure the world noticed the people around her instead. And in the end, without trying, without asking, without ever once opening a door because she expected something to walk back through it, she had built something that would outlast the storm, outlast the winter, outlast the silence that had settled over a dying town, and told it firmly and without apology that it was not done yet. One candle, one open door, one woman who believed that kindness was not a choice but a duty. That was all it took. That was always all it took.